am really looking forward to our conversation this morning because I think it's so incredibly timely, as we were just saying, when you see some of the coverage that's gone on in the media in the last few days around the housing issue. We're really fortunate to have some experts here to talk to us about the work they've been doing, what they're looking forward to. And I think really importantly to be talking about the objective data that really gives us a picture of where we are. And, as we know, Massachusetts is such a leader in education and biotech, and those are concentrations that bring people from all corners of the globe, from different cultures, different histories, different languages. I say all the time, we have communities in this county where, for instance, Malden, where the kids at school speak 81 languages, more than any other public high school in the United States. And that makes us an incredibly rich and varied county. But what it also reflects is that those people, so many who come here initially to go to school, want to stay in Massachusetts, and they start looking for communities to call home. And that fact that we bring those populations here, and there's such a vibrant racial and ethnic group population, is another attraction. But there is a tension because Massachusetts has a long history of housing discrimination and unfair practices. And, that doesn't happen because of law or policy. Those are human choices and people being unwilling to make the accommodations we need to provide affordable housing. We all have the ability to diversify the cities and towns that we live in and work in, and create more inclusive communities. And it is somewhat incredible that in 2023, we're still needing to pass legislation to force people to do that. And that creating that sense of belonging, of opening up our homes, our communities to everybody, really is what leads to communities seeing the value of developing affordable housing to attract socioeconomic diversity. And that same systemic kinds of processes that can be used to create discriminatory practices can also be flipped to create a more fair and just pathway to housing in our communities. And we see that same sort of sense of the other or making people feel different as underlying so many of the hate crimes, the bias actions that we see across our communities. And this is all a piece of our looking at that and really thinking about the perceptions that people have, the same things that lead to arguments in the grocery store or assaults on our streets. Those are the same feelings that lead communities to develop practices which don't make people feel welcome in those communities and don't provide for affordable housing for people there. We know that under the federal fair housing laws, fair housing has to mean that you can choose a place to live without regard to race, color, national origin, religion, sexual status, gender identity, disability, or familial status. And both state and federal laws prohibit discrimination in the sale or rental of housing by property owners, landlords, managers, mortgage lenders, or real estate agents. And they also include discrimination that might occur around the source of your income, particularly as it affects folks who have a Section 8 voucher. But even with those protections, people are able to affect discrimination in housing. A recent studies co-authored by our guest speakers today, using mock renters who were sent out into the Boston market, show how a renter's race or ethnicity or their voucher status impacted their results. And they found really substantial gaps. Black testers seeking apartments face discrimination in 71% of the cases. Just let that sink in for a moment. Almost 3/4 of the time that they went to rent an apartment, they faced some discrimination. Those with Section 8 housing vouchers face discrimination in 86% of the cases, regardless of their race. And that piece the things that have taken place over the last 5 years in terms of racial and social unrest only really highlight the demand that we address affordable housing issues, home ownership issues, and close that racial wealth gap. In 2021, and this is part of what spurred some of the most recent articles, the MBTA community laws was passed here in Massachusetts. And that law's purpose was to address the housing crisis by implementing zoning reforms that would require cities and towns to allow reasonable levels of multifamily housing development near an MBTA station. It requires that communities that are served by public transit zone from multifamily housing, and the ability of cities and towns to change their zoning laws would come with a simple majority vote. The Attorney General's office has said clearly that failure to comply can result in civil enforcement actions or liability under the Fair Housing Act. And very impressively, in April, Lexington, which has one of the most expensive housing markets in Massachusetts, became the first town in the state to pass zoning laws aiming to comply with the new statute. That town voted 107 to 63 to approve a series of new zones that would allow multifamily housing to be built in a town that right now is almost exclusively one-family homes. You may have seen just yesterday a Globe article that Newton is considering a similar proposal that would allow housing to go and buildings and developments to go up, so that up to a height of 4 stories, buildings near MBTA stations could be enlarged to include affordable housing. That's a step in the right direction, because in 2021, the census data indicated that Latino and Asian populations are really fueling the growth in Massachusetts and diversifying communities. The town of Hopkinton saw a 5-fold surge in its Asian population, and the Asian population in Lexington grew by 83%. Since 2010, Massachusetts residents who identify as either Hispanic or Latino grew from 627,000 to 887,000, and our Asian population grew from 307,000 to 504,000. So that change in our population just really illustrates the need to make housing available and to diversify our communities. So I'm really happy that our speakers are here today, 2 of whom, and Paige, don't feel left out, 2 of whom are Middlesex alums, have just done amazing work on this issue and are here to talk to us about that. And I'll begin with Professor Berman. Maybe I'll introduce everybody at once so that they can do an interchange among themselves. Professor Berman is a clinical professor of law emeritus at Suffolk University Law School. He's taught there for 23 years. He co-founded and is the academic director of a really amazing project, the Suffolk Housing Discrimination Testing Program, which really works to eliminate discrimination by testing, enforcement, education, academic study, and policy. Professor Berman and his clinical students have represented hundreds of indigent tenants in housing discrimination, eviction, or other housing-related court matters. Professor Berman's a frequent presenter on this topic at conferences, panels, and classrooms. He writes in the area of fair housing, including empirical studies of housing discrimination. And before he began that important academic career, he served as an assistant district attorney in Middlesex County and an assistant attorney general in the Office of the Attorney General. He's a graduate of Union College and of Boston University School of Law. Paige Stoparich is the clinical fellow for the program that Professor Berman runs. She joined that team in 2023 as part of a project with the Metro West Home Consortium. And in this role, she's going to be conducting fair housing testing aimed at fighting, again, discrimination in housing. Prior to joining HDTP, Paige worked as a housing and homelessness prevention attorney for Housing Families, Inc. in Chelsea. And during law school, she interned for numerous legal aid organizations in their housing divisions, including where I started at Greater Boston Legal Services, Harvard Legal Aid, and De Novo. She is a proud Suffolk Law alum who received her JD in 2021. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of South Carolina, where I think most interestingly, she was an NCAA Division I athlete in the equestrian team. So, and finally, but certainly not least, Kelly Vera, who is a clinical fellow and the director of investigations and outreach at the Suffolk Law School Housing Discrimination Testing Program. It's hard to say that all at once, but in 2020, Kelly joined the program as a part of a joint project with the City of Boston's Office of Fair Housing and Equity. She completed a 100 test project focused on race and source of income discrimination throughout the Boston neighborhoods. In her current role, Attorney Vera focuses on providing fair housing training, community outreach, and continuing her discrimination testing across Massachusetts. In 2021, she was selected to serve as a member of the Boston Advisory Board for BU's Center for Anti-Racist Research. She works with the board members to advise on local equity issues, community organizing, and mission-based planning. And prior to joining HDTP, we were lucky enough to have Kelly serving as an assistant district attorney here in Middlesex. She is also a proud Suffolk alum, you see the theme here, who graduated in 2019 and had previously earned her bachelor's degree in political science from Tufts. So I'm really happy to have all of you here. I'm looking forward to this discussion, and thank you for making time to be with us.
Thank you so much, DA Ryan, and thank you to Attorney Thompson for inviting us here and to speak to the task force. And thank you to the members of the task force for the work that you do every day in this area. As I'm sure you understand, your work is very connected to the work that we are doing, certainly with respect to fair housing, it's very much an issue of equity. So thank you for that very thorough introduction, DA Ryan. Our goal, I guess, for this session is to give a little bit of context to the issue of fair housing. And in that regard, Kelly's going to talk a little bit about kind of the history and government policies that led us to segregated communities and to the attendant wealth and opportunity gap. Paige is going to talk a bit about testing and what it is, and also a very exciting opportunity that we're so pleased to have with the Metro West Home Consortium, 13 communities in Middlesex County, to do testing work and to ultimately be able to generate some data and make some recommendations as to what the communities can do. I'll talk a little bit about our study and about some of the policies, including the ones that DA Ryan mentioned that are so recent, that are very positive ones that are coming out of the very communities in Middlesex County. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for having us. We're really excited to give this presentation today. So give me one moment. I'm just going to share my screen here. And I will apologize in advance. A cat may join me because she loves to help me with my presentation. So we'll see if she appears. But if she does, well, she'll help me out. So thank you again for having us here today. I'm going to start our presentation off today with a history lesson. It's really important for us to let people know the history of fair housing in the United States, because you kind of have to understand really the entire history of this country to have a good idea of how we got where we are. Sorry, I think I accidentally stopped screen sharing. One moment. So, it's important to us to understand the context of how we got where we are so that we can kind of talk about where we should be going in terms of fair housing, and, making sure that we understand both the history and where we can go. So before I start with the history, I want to ask you all to take a brief moment, if you can, to think about the idea of your dream home. What does your dream home look like? Where is it? Is there a particular place you would want your dream home to be? What type of home is it? Is it an apartment? Is it a condo? Is it a one-family home or a multifamily home? What would it take to live there? Is it something that you can currently afford? Is it something that you would have to work maybe for many years to save up for, or maybe find a loan or a grant or something like that? Is it something that you have already achieved? Are you lucky enough to be living in your dream home currently? Take a moment to think about that and to think about how the home and having a safe and healthy home is so critical to all aspects of life. It's not just the place that you lie down at night to go to bed, but also your community, right? So where you live can have an effect on all aspects of your life. The education you have access to, the healthcare you have access to, the people around you. What types of people do you live by? Who are your neighbors? The access to jobs and the type of career that you might have. You know, living close to where you work is something that a lot of people put, priority on. So think about that. Think about what it might take for you to get to your dream home. And also take a moment to think about how there are certain people in our society, because of things mostly out of their control, that are barred from access to their dream home, or sometimes from any home, because of the systemic barriers that have existed in this country since its beginning and continue to unfortunately exist, perhaps in a different form than, in what originally occurred. So like I said, I'm going to give a history lesson today. It's going to be about 400 years of history in a few minutes. So it's going to be a lot of information, but we just want you to have a solid idea of where we're coming from and talking about really the systemic issues that we're dealing with when it comes to housing access in the United States. So we're going to start with a timeline here. You'll see on the screen a timeline that starts in 1619. The reason that it starts all the way back then, again, about 400 years ago, is that 1619 is kind of considered the year that what we consider the chattel slave trade began in the country that we now call the United States. It's believed that 1619 is the year that was kind of the starting point of chattel slavery, where enslaved people from Africa were brought to Jamestown, Virginia. We don't know the true number of people that were forced into slavery from the African continent because the historical records are just unclear. But the best estimate that we have is that about 6 or 7 million people were kidnapped from the African continent and brought to the United States throughout the chattel slave trade. The kidnapping and enslaving of people from the African continent was outlawed in 1808. So, it didn't continue forever, but you'll see on our timeline, it jumps 200 years. So something that I think, a lot of people in the country don't have a good idea of is just the fact that chattel slavery went uninterrupted in the United States for 200 years. It just happened for 200 years. It was outlawed in 1808. But that outlawing doesn't mean that slavery stopped in 1808, as we know. It did continue. It was just the kidnapping, bringing people over across the Atlantic that was outlawed in 1808. The actual act of people being enslaved in this country continued, of course, past 1808 and was officially outlawed once President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and was codified in the United States Constitution in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. So again, 200 years in a couple minutes, but it just goes to show that, we have an equal history of slavery in the United States to life without it, 200 years with slavery and 200 years without it. So it is an integral part of the history of the United States. You can't really understand anything about the US without understanding the history of slavery, but especially housing, because slavery ties to the history of racial exclusion in the United States. Lots of people kind of look at US history and consider it this upward swing, like things started out really bad at the beginning when there was chattel slavery, and it's slowly gone up on this like clean upward spiral, right? But in reality, it's kind of been up and down. When you look at the worst of it during chattel slavery, it's not that things have steadily improved, but rather there have been small improvements and then times where things have kind of gone backwards. A good example is that right after slavery was outlawed in the United States, we see the Reconstruction period, where actually there was actually a lot of progress when it came to racial equality in terms of housing, in terms of other aspects of life. We saw that communities were becoming integrated. Once people who were enslaved were freed, they were able to go, in different parts of the United States and basically start a life for themselves. a lot of Black Americans who had been enslaved were quite successful during this time, both economically and societally in general. So we have the Reconstruction period where it seems like things are actually improving. Things are getting better. People are free. We're seeing all these improvements societally. And then there's a backlash. And that backlash starts kind of at the end of the 1800s and gets worse and worse throughout time up until about the mid-century. So think kind of the civil rights era where we see that big shift and things start to change for the better. So I'm going to talk about some of the tactics that we saw during this backlash. And really, I want to emphasize that a lot of the things that we see when it comes to housing exclusion were designed. They were on purpose. It was state, local, and the federal government taking actions to ensure that places remain segregated and that people were not allowed to live in a racially integrated society. So moving on our timeline here, we see the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So believe it or not, which actually I think is on my next slide. Believe it or not, the first kind of law that's similar to the Fair Housing Act actually passed all the way in 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 actually did make housing discrimination based on race illegal, which, great. The act is actually still on the books. You can still sue someone under the Civil Rights Act of 1866. But while on its face, it seems great, in reality, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was a very imperfect law. It didn't have much teeth. It was not really enforced at all. It did not have heavy enforcement measures. And something important to note about that law is that it actually excluded Native Americans. It specifically made it so Native Americans could still be discriminated against. So it is a very imperfect law, still on the books again, but it is kind of the start of the government taking some kind of action to remediate all of the racial discrimination that had been happening in the United States. Moving later in the 1800s, we see in the 1890s a bunch of different practices that are working to make sure that the United States is a racially segregated place.
Kelly,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but could you go to slideshow and play it? Because right now it's difficult to see.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
I was trying to, give me 1 second. I have notes also up, so that's making it a little difficult to share. One moment. Let me figure this out. I think I just have to.
That's great. That's much better. I think people can see that.
Yes, I'm just trying to pull up my notes as well. Actually, I can probably do that. Sorry, folks. It's I wish I had 2 screens. That makes it easier to pull up
No
notes.
worries.
But that's all right. So in the 1890s, we start to see a bunch of different both legal and private actions that are meant to keep people segregated. These tactics are known generally as Jim Crow laws. We're going to talk about a few of them, a few of the different tactics related to housing that state, local, and federal governments did to, again, ensure that people of color, especially Black people, were excluded from housing. So in the 1890s, we start to see a practice of what we call sundown towns. You might be familiar with the concept, but for anyone who isn't, a sundown town is either a town, a city, or sometimes an entire county, where the people of that county or the people in charge decide that people of color are allowed to be in the area during the day so they can work there, they can go about their daily business. But once the sun goes down, they are expected to leave the town. They are not allowed to be there once the sun goes down, quite literally. So of course, if you're allowed to be in a town during the day and not during the night, that means you can't live there. You can't sleep there, you can't have a home there. And we start to see these sundown towns cropping up all throughout the United States. It's not just in the South, it is all over. Some examples of sundown towns really exist all throughout the United States. And something important to know about sundown towns is they were not necessarily towns that were originally entirely white. Often sundown towns were integrated. There were people of color who lived there. And once the decision was made to make it a sundown town, those people were often violently forced from their homes. They were forced to leave so that the town could become entirely white. There was a Globe article that came out a couple of years ago that actually argues that Groton, Massachusetts in Middlesex County may have been a sundown town. There are lots of towns in the Northeast that, when you look at the history, seem like they might have been an informal sundown town. Though, of course, there are also sundown towns that literally we, historically have photos of signs that say that, people need to leave when the sun goes down.
And Kelly,
Yes.
just to underscore, this really shows the intersection of your work and our work, because violence and hate has always been a tool of discrimination.
Absolutely. Yeah, this was not, people asking politely that people leave at sundown. It was enforced through violence. Regina, question.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. Where can we take a look at that list? Is that list publicly available of the sundown towns in
A list of
Massachusetts?
sundown towns. Oh, I don't know if there's a formal list. I think there are different historical records that kind of argue. But if you look up like Groton Sundown Town, I believe a Globe article will come up, kind of talking about the history of Groton specifically. And I don't know,
Okay,
Bill, if you had any
Groton,
other
okay.
resources for that.
I'm going to look up the article and put it in the chat.
Thank you.
So we see sundown towns. You'll notice on the timeline, it says 1890s to blank. That is because we have no way of knowing that sundown towns no longer exist in 2023. And in fact, again, there are certain places in the United States that people still consider sundown towns, that people of color are still uncomfortable going into, especially at night. You'll see if you, I identify as Black, and I know within the Black community, there are people who literally have travel blogs that talk about towns that Black people should not go to. Again, in 2023, because either they were historically sundown towns or they still kind of have those aspects. So it's not something that is just in the past. Next, moving on into the 1900s, getting closer to present day, we see exclusionary zoning. So again, you might be familiar with the idea of zoning, but basically government started taking actions to make sure that, again, neighborhoods and areas remain segregated. And they started doing it in creative ways where they wouldn't, well, I will say at first zoning laws were often explicitly racist. They would say in the law itself that, people of color or Black people or, a specific group was not allowed in a particular neighborhood. But with time, the Supreme Court would, pass, would basically outlaw that kind of practice, and people would find a way around it. So for example, because of the historical oppression of Black people, often they did not have access to the ability to afford a single family home because it was expensive. They didn't have access to loans, et cetera. So zoning an area to be just a single family zoning area is basically, in essence, making it so people of color cannot live there. And zoning was used in that way quite purposefully. Another local thing is that Brookline is actually kind of known as one of the originators of these types of laws, Brookline in Massachusetts. So again, it is a local issue and not just something that's in certain parts of the country. We also have restrictive covenants. So similarly, another tactic of making sure that areas remain segregated, we would see people who would write into their deeds when they own a home, saying something to the effect of, I will not sell you this house unless you agree to never sell it to a Black person or to never sell it to a Native American person or an Asian person, et cetera. And unfortunately, because this was such a widespread practice, a lot of people, if they look back far enough in their deeds, this racist language still exists in the deed, unless it's been, remediated. So that's kind of most of the timeline. We're getting into the civil rights era now. So I don't want to run too much on time, so I'm going to explain this clip that we usually show. So we're talking about the mid-century now, 1950s, 1960s. Of course, we start seeing uprisings all over the United States when it comes to racial oppression and racial issues. And of course, I know you're all familiar with Dr. King and his work. So I think something that folks don't necessarily know is that leading up to Dr. King's assassination, fair housing was actually one of the issues he was most passionate about. He was giving speeches all over the country about fair housing issues and housing segregation. In fact, one of his last speeches touches on housing as an important issue. What we saw in the 1960s is that while people were starting to come around to the idea of public places being desegregated, there was a lot of resistance to the idea of housing being desegregated. You would see folks say, I'm fine with schools being racially integrated. I'm fine with, Black people be able to be in public and not have to sit on the back of the bus, but I draw the line at changing my neighborhood. So Dr. King was speaking out against that. And his last speech, given on April 3rd of 1968, actually, the speech, and I wish I had time to show you, but essentially in the speech, he says that he doesn't know how much time he has left, as in how much time he has left alive, but that he has reached the mountaintop. He's seen that things can change. He's seen that change is happening. So he's okay with the fact that he doesn't know how much time he has left on Earth. And the eerie thing about this speech is that he says that he doesn't know how much time he has, and he was assassinated the next day on April 4th, 1968. So, Dr. King knew that his life was on the line for these issues. He knew that he was putting his life at risk, that there were people who wanted to harm him because of what he was saying, because of the causes that he was fighting for. And the Fair Housing Act, because it was so unpopular to desegregate housing at the time, actually failed the first time it was introduced in Congress. It did not pass. And it finally did pass 1 week after Dr. King was assassinated. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Dr. King literally died for the Fair Housing Act. He died for fair housing. He died for issues of racial equality. And the Fair Housing Act really got the boost that it needed, once the country was reacting to his murder. So the Fair Housing Act passes. Another thing that affects kind of the state of the country at that time is the Kerner Report. The federal government put together the Kerner Commission to look at housing in the United States. And a pretty famous quote from the report is, "Our nation is moving towards two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal." So this is just a newspaper article showing, Dr. King's assassination. And again, the Fair Housing Act was passed 7 days after he was murdered. So on April 11th, 1968, the Fair Housing Act is passed and signed into law. And something we want you folks to understand about the Fair Housing Act is that it has two major components, and sometimes only the first component is talked about, and we think both are equally important. So the first one is what you might think of, outlawing housing discrimination, making it so you cannot deny people housing, treat people unequally when it comes to housing, things like that. But then there's also a mandate to affirmatively further fair housing, also referred to, people will call it AFFH. So the AFFH part of the Fair Housing Act makes it so communities that have benefited from this historical discrimination that we've just been talking about are required to take action, proactive action to fix it. So it's not just that we wait until someone's discriminated against and take action then. Communities are being asked to take action to undo all of the purposeful things that were done to keep people segregated. And that's particularly, I think, important for, Middlesex County, because suburbs were really the prime benefactors of all these decisions that made people, that excluded people from housing. You see a lot of suburbs, not only in Massachusetts, but all throughout the United States, that are still majority white because of historical actions that were taken to keep people of color out. So these communities are being asked through many different ways to take action to fix it and to undo what was done. So quickly, because I know I might be going over time a bit, the Fair Housing Act outlawed several types of housing discrimination, refusing to rent to someone, making housing unavailable, lying to people about housing. So what we see in testing a lot is someone will call about housing, and for example, if it has to do with race, the white tester that we send in will be told that the unit's available, and let's say the Black tester is told that it already rented and they can't view it, even though that's not true. Other things, historical things we saw, like redlining, that's, unlawful under the Fair Housing Act. Putting a discriminatory ad is unlawful. So if you ever see an ad posted for a list for housing that says something like, no Section 8, that's illegal in Massachusetts. So that in itself, just posting that ad with discriminatory language is a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Have things change? This is a photo from the what's recognized as the Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1965. This is one of the many uprisings happening in neighborhoods all throughout the United States, where Black Americans were basically taking a stand against the fact that they were forced to live in what were referred to as slums or ghettos because they were not allowed to live anywhere else. That's in 1965. This is an article from September 2022, but the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi is still happening right now. There's still unsafe water in Jackson, and Jackson, Mississippi is an 82% Black community that's being affected by environmental racism and choices by the government to neglect that town. And then finally, here we have the 8 Mile, which you might be familiar with. 8 Miles in Detroit. You can see here, this is census data from 2010, so not too long ago. But what you're seeing on the map here is blue represents white people, and there's a little dot to represent each white person, and green represents Black people in Detroit. And you see it's a perfect 50-50 split. And the reason we like to show this map is that it shows that this was designed. This did not happen by coincidence. It's not that all the white people in Detroit just happen to want to live in the North and all the Black people in Detroit happen to want to live in the South. It was that the government and private actors made it so Black people had to live south of the 8 Mile and white people were afforded the ability to live in the other part. And then another really stark data that came out recently in Massachusetts is that there was a study to look at the wealth in Massachusetts, particularly in the Boston area. And it was found that the average net worth of a white family in Boston was $247,500. And the average net worth for a Black family in the US, or in Boston rather, specifically in Boston, was $8, literally $8. So almost $250,000 versus $8. That really can only be the result of housing exclusion because most people's biggest form of net worth or biggest form of wealth is a house or the ability to own a home, which, of course, Black Americans were excluded from. So that is the history lesson. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague to talk about fair housing more in general. But thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly.
And thank you again to DA Ryan for having us and to the rest of the task force for joining us today. So I'm just going to give a brief overview about the fair housing laws as well as the current project that I have undertaken. So fair housing laws, kind of just like my colleague Kelly had mentioned, are governed by 3 different types of laws. So you have the federal laws, which are the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination of sale, rental, or purchase and leasing of a house based on a protected class. Massachusetts has the Massachusetts General Law 151B, which is an anti-discrimination law. And then, of course, different cities and towns have their own ordinances about how they govern discrimination in that area. What is a protected class? So a protected class is a characteristic of a person determined by law that cannot be targeted for discrimination. So when you're looking for a fair housing violation, you have to have 2 things. You have to have the prohibited conduct under the law, but you also have to have that action being done and or directed towards a person who is part of those protected classes. So protected classes, both federally and in Massachusetts, the Fair Housing Act federal law covers a few big ones that I'm sure we're all familiar with: race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, and national origin. But Massachusetts takes it even further and covers more characteristics that the federal Fair Housing Act does not. So in Massachusetts, on top of the protected classes under the Fair Housing Act, Massachusetts also covers age, military status, gender identity, sexual orientation, marital status, receipt of public assistance. So for example, Section 8 voucher, genetic information, and ancestry. So Massachusetts definitely offers more comprehensive protections for protected classes than federal law. And when you're looking to enforce any sort of violation, there are different enforcement agencies. So you have HUD, which is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, MCAD, and then local enforcement agencies, Boston Fair Housing Commission, the Cambridge Human Rights Commission, and then of course, states and federal courts as well. So what is testing? Testing, the goal of testing is basically we're trying to look at the typical business practices of realtors, landlords, realty companies, and we're trying to gather objective, unbiased information about those interactions and the typical business practices. We want fact-based information to develop an objective report. And ultimately, of course, the goal is to eliminate illegal housing discrimination. When we're conducting testing, there are 3 types of tests that we can run: systemic-based testing, complaint-based testing, and research-based testing. All right, so when we send testers out, of course, one will be part of, one of the protected classes. And once the test is completed, we will examine all of the facts and the interactions in order to come to a conclusion. And so this is just a little bit of an example of differential treatment that we see, and we call it discrimination with a smile. It is rare, but it does happen. But it is still rare that, a person goes to rent an apartment and the housing provider says, "Oh, I'm not going to rent to you because you are Black or because you are disabled." Typically, it doesn't happen like that. And so there are very small nuances in treatment. And so this just kind of shows that. So tester A, the housing provider shook their hand, but did the housing provider shake tester B's hand? Did the housing provider offer an application or offer information on next steps moving forward with the apartment? Was the protected class tester shown as many units as tester A? Or perhaps was tester A given a waiver fee or, first month free rent? Did tester B receive that kind of treatment as well? And so those are just some small differences that we see in testing that, would be hard to uncover if we didn't conduct testing the way that we do. So currently, the project that I am working on and the project that gave me the opportunity to be part of Suffolk's housing discrimination testing program is the West Metro Home Consortium. You'll see in the picture the cities and towns that make up that consortium, and 11 of them which are in Middlesex. And again, this home consortium is comprised of 13 municipalities, and the city of Newton is the lead on the consortium. And this project is aimed at identifying the impediments of fair housing and identifying meaningful strategies and actions that these communities can take to affirmatively further fair housing in order to, allow members of the protected classes to have access to fair and equitable housing. So again, this is a fairly new project. It just started in March of 2023. So this is preliminary data, please keep in mind. So far, a total of 18 tests have been conducted. 4 of those tests are still ongoing, but at least 1 test has been run in each of the 13 communities. The data to date, again, please keep in mind this is preliminary data, but 7 tests, the data was inconclusive. 5 tests, no evidence of discrimination was found. But then in 2 tests, there was evidence of discrimination that was found. And so this, just furthers our point that discrimination is out there. It does happen. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight that our team has learned during running this project is that there are actually 3 specific communities, 2 of them which are in Middlesex, where thus far we have not been able to conduct testing based on source of income, so using a voucher, because what we have found thus far is that there are actually no apartments available in these communities that fit within the payment standards that are needed for a voucher. So if I was a single person with a voucher for a 1-bedroom or a voucher with a 2-bedroom, what we're finding, again, this is a new project, but what we're finding is that I wouldn't be able to move to some of these towns and communities because there are no apartments that, are within the socioeconomic standard that I need. And so, that's just something that we're noticing, a specific trend. And like I said, 2 of those communities are in Middlesex County. And so, again, just furthering our, what we know, that housing discrimination does exist, but hopefully through this project and future projects, we're able to affirmatively further fair housing and work with communities and counties in order to provide access to fair and equal housing for everybody. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Professor Berman, who is going to talk about the study that the team did recently, a couple years ago, and then as well as innovative legislation, legislative policies and practices that our team has been implementing in order to affirmatively further fair housing.
So I'm going to go through this rather quickly so we can have a bit of time for questions. On Paige's last point, it really underscores what DA Ryan said at the top about what's happening in Lexington and Newton to expand the availability of affordable housing, because in some towns, if you do have a voucher, you're out of luck. So we did a study on race and source of income, in part because we were very well aware through our anecdotal representation of clients that particularly with respect to vouchers, there's a lot of discrimination out there. And while, Paige talked about how it's not typically overt, it often is overt with this protected class. People will say, sorry, we don't take vouchers directly to individuals, even though that's illegal. So we wanted to see, well, how much is that happening? What's the data, and what do policymakers, take from that, and what's actually happening. So let's see the next slide, Kelly. So we worked with the analysis group, which is an economic analysis expert. They helped us set this up in a randomized way so we get statistically significant data. So we sent 4 different testers, 2 black, 2 white, 2 market rate, 2 voucher holders, to each of 50 different properties in order to get statistically significant evidence. Next slide. And so we used pair testing, and Paige talked about what that was. All of the testers who we sent were equally qualified. And what we found was rather surprising. As DA Ryan said at the top, these were our results. And it was much higher in terms of the rates of discrimination than we anticipated. So ghosting, for example, a full 42% of the time, if you had a voucher, once they found out you had a voucher, the housing provider stopped communicating with the tester. And we know that the other testers were getting communication. So most often the white market rate tester would get to see the most properties that they were interested in. But if you had a voucher, you only got to see an average of 15% of the property. So it's almost as if you had to inquire about 10 properties to be able to see one. And once you saw that one, you still got discriminated against. So you would have to, if you wanted to see even a small number, even 5 apartments, you have to call 50 housing providers. And you can see what kind of a burden that is for our most vulnerable tenants who are trying to use a voucher, and they have a time clock. They have to do it within several months or they lose what will be their greatest asset. Next slide. And so this is the data on ghosting. If you didn't have a voucher, it only happened 10% of the time. If you had a voucher, it happened 42% of the time. Next slide. This slide depicts the data on touring a unit. So if you wanted to tour a unit and you were white, you didn't have a voucher, you got to see 80% of the units. If you were black with no voucher and you were equally qualified, you only saw 48%. So a very significant part of the time, if you're black, you don't even get to see it. And black, we used names associated with race. And so if you had a black sounding name, a full 9% of the time, you'd be screened out altogether just because of your name. And that's, we can say that based on the data to a statistically significant level, and our experts, provided us with the analysis for that. So if you, as you can see, if you had a voucher, it didn't matter really your race. You were going to be discriminated against very significantly, and you were almost always, it was very difficult to see even one apartment. Next slide. So I put this slide in again, just because the idea of the wealth and opportunity gap is very much tied to the history that Kelly talked about, and the context behind why we have segregated communities and why it's so important. The work that we see in Lexington and Newton and other communities in Middlesex County and elsewhere to open opportunities up. This wealth and opportunity gap is because of these specific policies. It doesn't have to do with somebody's race. The idea that it would is a racist notion. So Black people have less because they've had fewer opportunities. Let's go to the next slide. And this is a relatively recent study, from out of Harvard, that showed what we would anticipate. If you have access to a higher opportunity neighborhood, all of the things, the markers of success in a person increase. So if someone's able to move to a better neighborhood, they have better outcomes in life. And you would expect that, but this research shows it. And it's not the person, it's where the person lives. And so if that person can never come live in a particular town, it's a town of opportunity because they can't ever afford to do it, they lose these opportunities. And The Color of Law, many of you are familiar with, by Richard Rothstein. It's a very good source material for this history in this context. And, Kelly outlined the history and these policies that led to segregation. But if you look at redlined communities today, there's a lot of disadvantages that overlay on having ended up in a redlined community, like how much are you exposed to environmental contaminants? What is the effect of climate change on your particular neighborhood? And again, it's why it's so important, if people do want to move out of neighborhoods that are historically redlined, and many times people don't want to move out. They just want more resources to make their neighborhood better. But if they do, they should have that opportunity. And we, as representatives of the government and advocates, should be advocating for that as a matter of redress for the policies that caused this segregation to begin with. Next slide. So there's some policies that are out there now that you could support. This one I think is very important. It's before the legislature now, before the Joint Committee on Housing, co-sponsored by Senator Lydia Edwards and others, to create an Office of Fair Housing and a Fair Housing Trust Fund that would allow the legislature to put resources into the kind of work that we do, the services related to fair housing. To have this office is very important because it will look at what is the state doing vis-a-vis fair housing across all of its agencies and on a very high level. And it is a matter of equity. And so it does warrant the resources. Next slide. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to do this very quickly. We found that 93% of the time our testers interacted with brokers and salespeople. And so they were actually discriminated against individuals at a very high rate. And when we did some research on it, we found also that the system to suspend a license, for example, of a broker or a salesperson is broken. Nobody's being suspended. And so we've proposed modest legislation to change that. And this requires a commission to look at it, requires brokers to get training, which is important, a little bit of transparency with the board, change in the membership of the board. Next slide. And right now, only the MCAD can refer a broker for suspension if there's a finding on a case that they discriminated against someone, but we know that most cases settle, so there's never a finding. And we know that the data we were able to find out, nobody is being suspended for discrimination. This is very modest. It just says the AG's office should be able to refer a case for suspension as well, because the AG can bring a case directly in court if it goes to trial, if there's a finding. Under the current law, they have no authority to refer that for suspension because it wasn't in front of the MCAD. So we're just saying this is a technical fix, an oversight. The AG should have the same power, so should the Boston Fair Housing Commission and Cambridge Human Rights Commission that also determine cases. Next slide. So MBA Communities law that DA Ryan referenced requires communities that are around public transport to have denser zoning, and that's as a way to kind of redress for the idea that zoning was used to keep people out of communities, to try and bring opportunity to have a more diverse community. And so the Lexington law is they are the first to comply with this. If anyone's heard of Bill McKibben's book, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon, he's known for climate change activities, but he grew up in Lexington, and he writes about how in the 70s, a similar proposal passed town meeting, but then was voted down in a referendum. And so this is really significant progress, and it goes well beyond what's required of Lexington, and Newton's proposal would do the same. So in a decade, there were 1,100 apartments created in Newton. Newton's current proposal would allow for 10,000 more. It's very, very significant, and it's 8,000 more than they're required. So I'll leave you with this part. It's very positive what's happening now in our communities. The work in Middlesex County is very positive and very important. People are taking this issue seriously, and we can make great strides in undoing, some of these historic wrongs if we do the right thing now, as communities are signaling they're willing to do. So you can feel free to use us as a resource. So if you run across people who think they've been discriminated against in the housing context, please feel free to have them call our intake line. If any one of you is able to be a tester, we'll train you and you could assist in that. Or if you know people who are interested, have them contact Kelly. Forgive us for going a little bit over time. If people are able to stay for questions, we're happy to take the questions now. And again, thank you so much.
That was great. Thank you so much. That was so much information to squeeze in there all at once. So I really appreciate that. All right, so we have a couple of housekeeping questions. I know, Kelly, you have a survey that you'd like people to take, and people are asking how they can get the slides. We record this, so we'll put the recording up within a day or two. People have questions, you can either put them in the chat, you can raise your hand, or you can physically just speak. We've a small enough group to do that.
I had a quick question, Marion. As we talked about these, Lexington and Newton and what they're proposed to do, can you talk a little bit about the trust funds that you mentioned? Like, how do we get away from developers, perhaps, if there's different units that are designated for affordable housing and so forth, or I don't know if that's part of this proposal. How do we get away from towns and cities using that little caveat of developers opting out by either putting it into the trust fund and so forth?
So I'm not sure if you're referring to, I read an article, it might have been yesterday, that cited an example of one town that used money that's meant for affordable housing in order to buy a property that a developer was proposing affordable housing for, because that particular fund also allows the funds to be used for conservation. And so if that's what you're referring to, I think, it is problematic, and that probably requires, some kind of legislative fix. The trust fund I mentioned that's not yet law, and that would be the way the law is written, it doesn't come with funding, but the legislature would have the opportunity to fund this Fair Housing Trust Fund, and then it could give grants to entities that would do the kind of fair housing and other work that we do throughout the Commonwealth. And so it's just a way that the legislature could and should, I think, show the importance of fair housing work, both in terms of enforcement and, as Kelly mentioned, affirmatively furthering fair housing, training people, teaching people, kind of working with communities to create the opportunities that could make more inclusive and diverse communities.
I'd like to make a couple of comments. So I live in Groton, where well known as a pretty wealthy community and a wonderful place to live. I'm also chair of the Affordable Housing Trust. We would love to be able to build affordable housing. Market rate affordable apartments are never going to exist in Groton because it costs a lot of money to buy land. And therefore, you're going to build something that you can sell or rent for a lot of money to make up your to keep solvent as a builder. So I know it's not a very appealing prospect, but one of the things I think the state could do is to help us actually buy land. And again, it's expensive. That's why we can't do it ourselves, but to buy land to build affordable housing. And I know for a fact, we're not the only wealthy community that is faced with this dilemma. We'd love to build affordable housing. All we have to do, we can look at land that the town owns that's not built on, but frankly, the only land the town owns that's not built on probably has some obstacles to building on, because the town wouldn't have come into possession of it if it was really good buildable land. So it's just a conundrum that even though we are wealthy communities, and it would be a lot of money, it would be really helpful for the state to look at that aspect of it.
Yes, I do agree. And obviously, a lot of this is, tied into the economics of development. There is a statute on the books that we have had modest success with, 40B.
Right. That's the only way that we've had affordable housing. I shouldn't say the only way. We have inclusionary zoning. So if you build a large subdivision, you're also required to build a portion of affordable units. But 40Bs are the way that we've ended up with some affordable housing.
Yes, and so for those who are not familiar with it, it allows relief from the zoning, and it allows denser developments in communities that don't have 10% of affordable housing or a certain percentage of land set aside. And it's not been perfect, but it has allowed for the creation of, a decent number of affordable housing units throughout the state. And I do think, people in this space and people in general are aware that we need to be looking at this from many different angles. And there's not one specific policy solution, but it's not perfect.
The question in the chat that asks, is there a law that addresses towns that make rules that all affordable housing needs to be offered first to previous residents and gives them priority on rentals?
So, I suppose that part of the issue there is if it's a town, that has historically, ended up excluding, people of color through the policies that we talked about. And so the people who happen to be living there look like everyone else in the community, there is a potential argument that under the Fair Housing Act, that statute or regulation has a disparate impact on people in a protected class. And so it violates the Fair Housing Act. The problem with that is it's very, very resource intensive to bring cases like that. There's only very few entities that have the capacity to bring cases like that. The courts have kind of tightened up the requirements for it, so it's a bit more difficult to prove cases like that. But I think that would be the way to approach it.
And what about, is there a time restriction on reporting discrimination? If you've been the victim of discrimination?
So there is a statute of limitations.
Have them on hand, Bill. I have a document that I refer
Thank you,
to.
Kelly.
So yes, there's statute of limitations. It depends on where you're looking to file the complaint. If you're looking to go to the federal government, to HUD, you have 1 year. If you're looking to go to federal or housing court, for example, you would have 2 years. The MCAD gives you 300 days. And I just have the City of Boston's Fair Housing Commission, that's 6 months. So it really depends where you want to file and where the discrimination happened. But that's something that, a fair housing attorney would definitely know and be able to provide guidance on.
And the other piece with respect to that issue is if it is a continuing violation, then you have the ability to bring a case. So for example, if we've done, a test that's out of the statute of limitations, and then we've done 2 more tests that are within the statute of limitations, you could also bring the allegation that's outside if the court accepts an argument that this discrimination has been ongoing. So it's a way to argue that it should be within the statute and you should be able to bring it.
Thank you. Anybody else? Questions, thoughts? Well, I hope this has been a great resource. This has been an amazing presentation. We'll make the recording of it available. I think you've had the generous offer from Professor Berman that they're willing to be helpful to people you may encounter. And thank you all so very much for being here, and to our presenters, we owe you a debt. Thank you.
And we've given the slides to Antonio, so you can please feel free to share those. Thank you so much for having us.
Well, thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you
Take
so much.
care. Bye-bye.